Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Evelyn Farkas, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and currently a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled, "Is Serbia Preparing for War?" Serbia has embarked on a campaign of military rearmament. Increasing supplies of Russian and Chinese weapons could presage a regional arms race with Croatia and challenge the security of both Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Serbia has recently acquired 30 modernized T-72 tanks and 30 armored combat vehicles from Russia. Although officials have described these deliveries as a donation in an attempt to circumvent Western sanctions on Moscow, they signal closer military ties with Russia that can undercut Serbia's relations with NATO. Belgrade is due to purchase additional military equipment from Moscow, including MiG fighters and surface-to-air missile systems. China has also agreed to sell armed drones to Belgrade, which can be used for missile strikes. Serbia's military purchases will fuel an arms build-up that primarily involves Croatia. Zagreb is planning to purchase mobile artillery systems and new fighter aircraft from the US military. It also plans to acquire ballistic missiles with a range of 300 kilometers that could alter the military balance in the region. In response, Belgrade has appealed to Moscow for the sale of S-300 missile defense systems. War between Serbia and Croatia currently seems unlikely, as Zagreb is both restrained and protected by its NATO membership. Nonetheless, an arms build-up will raise the political temperature throughout the region, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo. Croatia's military modernization will demonstrate that Serbia is becoming overly dependent on Moscow and will receive inferior equipment to that of its NATO neighbors. Some analysts also speculate that Washington may deliberately arm Croatia as a warning against any Serbian military intervention in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Belgrade is unlikely to engage in a military adventure in Kosovo, given the US and NATO presence and their commitment to defending the young state. Nonetheless, increasing military acquisitions will be seen as a threat to Kosovo's integrity. Paradoxically, though, Serbia's maneuvers should boost Pristina's drive towards creating its own army and defense structure. The transformation of the Kosovo security force into a fully capable military force will be seen as the best deterrent against outside threats that will gradually take much of the defense burden from the US and NATO. Serbia's military build-up will strengthen the position of those Western policymakers who encourage Kosovo to develop its own armed forces and begin the journey towards NATO membership. Although Kosovo's NATO accession may be years away, Belgrade's aggressive actions may actually hasten that process. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Evelyn Farkas, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and currently a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you for joining me on the show, Evelyn.
Thank you for having me in the hot seat.
It's hot seat for everyone, so it's not just for you, don't worry.
Okay, good.
Let's jump right in. Washington is in the midst of this presidential impeachment probe that could have some serious reverberations for US foreign and security policy, which is what I want to focus on. But can you first explain to our viewers what triggered this congressional investigation? What was the driver? What was the trigger? What happened?
Right. Well, if I can go back just a second, a hot second, you know that President Trump was already investigated by a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, and that was called the Muller Investigation.
Right.
And the subject of that investigation was basically, did the Russians help President Trump get elected? Did he help? Did he encourage them? And did he obstruct justice? Mm-hmm. The findings were that he looks like he didn't seek the assistance or work with the Russians. He probably did obstruct justice, but the report fell short of making any recommendations to Congress.
Right.
And so Congress was left holding a report. And impeachment ultimately is a very political decision. And so Nancy Pelosi, who is the Democratic leader of the House, said, I'm not going to move with impeachment on the basis of the Mueller report. But the president gave her, I guess you would call it a political gift, because, and a whistleblower actually gave America a political gift, if you believe, and I do believe in the documentation, everything we've seen so far, which is to say that it turns out that the day after Robert Mueller went up to Capitol Hill to testify about his report, and essentially it was a big relief for the president because he wasn't an energetic defendant. He wasn't energetically explaining what was in the report. And it allowed the Republicans to defend the president, and the Mueller report and the accusations pertaining to Russia in 2016 evaporated. Well, it looked like they were going to evaporate, but really almost the next day the president got on the phone with the president of Ukraine, the relatively newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yep.
And he essentially in that phone call asked Zelensky said, thank you so much for the military assistance. Now that military assistance had been put on hold, meaning the money wasn't being spent to give Ukraine what they needed a few months before this phone call by the president, we now know. In any event, the Ukrainians likely knew. The Ukrainians were on the phone with the president of Ukraine, with our president, and our president said, right after the Ukrainians said, thank you for the military assistance, he said, yes, but I need a favor from you, though. So it was very clear, yes, I'm giving you that assistance, but I need a favor from you. And at the same time, the special envoy from the U.S. to Ukraine was trying to set up a meeting at the White House, which President Zelensky very much wanted as well. But more importantly, President Zelensky needed that military assistance, and it was being held up. And the favor that our president asked was direct foreign interference in the U.S. elections, which is to say, or indirect, but either way, foreign interference in the elections, which is to say he asked President Zelensky to come up with dirt on President Biden, the top Democratic candidate now, it looks like. I mean, he's not the candidate yet, but he's in the running to become a Democratic candidate running against our current president, President Trump. He said, I would like dirt on him. He didn't use those words, but he said, there's something terrible and you have to give us information about this terrible thing that Vice President Biden did with his son. And we can get into that if you like. The other thing he said was that there's something about 2016, and he basically put out in the phone call a conspiracy theory about a server that somehow was missing, a Democratic National Committee server, which, by the way, was never missing. But there's
CrowdStrike, I think it is.
CrowdStrike
Yeah.
was called in by the Democratic National Party to look at the servers and investigate what had happened. And they were the ones that put together probably the first report saying the Russians were responsible. There's this conspiracy theory that there's a server that's missing, that CrowdStrike never saw, and that's somehow in Ukraine. And so now President Trump is also trying to pin the blame a little bit on Ukraine, and he's trying to get the new Ukrainian president to also participate in that whole effort, meaning provide some information that would implicate his country or his countrymen in the 2016 elections.
Right. Plus, of course, it would tend to whitewash Russia.
Well, that's the most important point of all of this, because really, I mean, I think of the things that people need to know, the main beneficiary of all of this is Vladimir Putin. And so, and by the way, we're taping this on his birthday, the day that that our president made a decision with regard to Syria, which is a very big birthday present to Vladimir Putin. So in any event, this phone call was also, in essence, not only a phone call where President Trump was trying to get a political favor for himself personally, not something for the United States, but for himself. He was also trying to cast a shadow of a doubt on whether Russia interfered in our elections in 2016.
So if it's proven, it's basically a form of abuse of power, but to be more specific, it's soliciting foreign assistance for personal political benefit.
Yeah. So there are two issues here. So one is, it is a crime to get assistance in your campaign from a foreign country. So this would be a campaign contribution from a foreign country.
Right.
Just as, again, the Russian meetings that they had with Trump officials was seen as soliciting a potential gift from Russia. In this case, again, he directly asked for it from Ukraine. So it's very obvious he wants this gift. It's a gift of value, and that would be enough in a federal court if he wasn't the sitting president to put someone in jail, which means some of his aides may be in jeopardy if they were involved in this solicitation.
Right.
The second issue, of course, is that he's the president, and the Constitution says you can impeach a president for high crimes and misdemeanors. And most people believe having a foreign country interfere to sway our elections, to sway public opinion, to, in essence, invalidate your free will, your ability to make a vote free of foreign interference. Just all you want is U.S. information, not foreign information, because they want something different. They don't want something good for America and Americans. So if you have a president trying to help a foreign government get influence over U.S. citizens and their vote, that is pretty clearly a high crime.
Right, which makes the whole whistleblower very important, the whistleblower concept.
Yes.
Could you explain that? Because I don't think that exists, in addition to impeachment not existing in the Balkans, I don't think they have this concept of an independent or a whistleblower that can go to an independent authority to report some abuse of power within particular departments. Can you explain this to us?
Well, in the Balkans, you don't have the impeachment because essentially the leader comes out of parliament, and so parliament can vote, take a vote of no confidence.
Sure.
We don't have a way of, our vote of no confidence is this other means,
Except
but it's two chambers, it's very hard.
Even if there's a direct election of a president, I don't think there's an impeachment process in Eastern Europe. I
Okay.
don't think so, but need to check that.
And that's dangerous, because then what happens is you have people go to the street to get the leadership change and to change the direction of the country, as we saw in Ukraine. And then the international community has to cobble together a compromise, which we saw in the case of Ukraine.
Exactly.
So the other part of your question had to do with
The whistleblower.
concept, That's very interesting, because that's also relatively new to U.S. history, as you know. You're a little older than I am. I was alive during Watergate and alive during the bad days when the CIA, when it was revealed what the CIA did in many countries overseas.
Right.
So if you hear, many Russians will say, oh, the U.S. interferes also, and the U.S. kills people also. Well, we had a bad history of bad interventions and bad killings, and we also, more recently, of course, have had some interventions that have not been successful, or there are problems with them. But we tried as a government and as a society to learn from our mistakes. And so because the CIA abused its power, the Congress stepped in and said, we want a provision so that a patriotic American working within the intelligence agencies, although actually there are now whistleblowers in every department and agency. But this one was special because the whistleblowers in the other departments and agencies report up to the head of that department. So if I at the Department of Defense have a problem with the secretary or with something that's happening in the Department of Defense, I whistleblow, but my whistle gets heard by the head of the agencies, so the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
In the case of the intelligence community, because what they're doing is so secret and so sensitive, and they're really doing the American people's work with very few eyes on what they're doing, their whistle gets automatically taken from the Director of National Intelligence, who's in charge of all the intelligence agencies, right up to Capitol Hill, to the intelligence agencies where there are special, those chairmen and ranking members, so the senior Democrat, senior Republican, on the House and the Senate side, they have special security clearances. They know all of the very top secret things that there is to know about covert operations, et cetera, so they can look at the whistleblower complaint.
Right.
And what happened here was that the head of the directorate, the head of all of intelligence, the Director of National Intelligence, was new on the job, and he's still acting. And so he, frankly speaking, I know the man, and I think he's very patriotic, but he got nervous and exhibiting, I would say, poor judgment, because his Inspector General said this should go right up to the Hill, to Congress.
Right.
He said, well, let me call the White House, which was poor judgment because the complaint was about the White House.
Exactly, yeah. Explain to our viewers also the process itself. I mean, impeachment happens in the House, and then there's another process in the Senate. Can you explain that to us?
So in the House, what happens is you have, in essence, a case where there are certain counts that are made against the president. So one would be obstruction of their inquiry, and we see this already now where the president is not handing over documents, is not allowing significant witnesses to come and be deposed, right? At the end of all of this, the leadership of the House will say, we have X number of counts against the president. So one will be this obstruction, another one will be soliciting foreign assistance. On top of the Ukraine issue, just last week, I believe it was Friday, the president was speaking to the press right before he boarded a helicopter and said, yes, someone asked him about trade talks with China, and then almost in the next breath he said, and yes, I would like China also to look into what the Bidens have done with their business dealings in China. And by the way, there's no evidence that either Biden has done anything illegal. Maybe it was a little bit inappropriate for Hunter Biden to take some of the positions he has taken, or at least the one in Ukraine, but none of it was illegal, and none of it was really secret per se. And Vice President Biden's actions, if anything, they might have harmed the interest of the company in question in Ukraine, not helped it by calling on getting rid of the bad prosecutor general. Right. So I'm going off on a little tangent.
No, it's good to know because, as you know, Biden has a very close connection with Kosovo, so we're very much interested in what's happening.
Exactly.
There,
So very quickly, what will happen is the House will say, we charge the president with obstructing justice, soliciting assistance from a foreign country in order to help his personal political interests, not American interests. And maybe they'll add some others because he's been also doing some corrupt business practices, basically using his office to solicit foreign governments to stay at his hotels.
Alleged at the moment, but
okay. But they may find substantiating evidence for that and then bring that also up as a count. Then they vote. Are we going to charge the president with these counts? And the whole House will vote. Now, they pretty much have almost all the Democrats, if not all the Democrats.
It's a simple majority there.
And it's simple majority, and they probably have one or two Republicans. They have the independent Justin Amash probably, who's already said, I disagree with the way this president's governing. I disagree with the lack of ability of the Republican Party to hold him accountable. And so I'm now an independent. And there are a couple of other members, some of whom are not running for office again, so it's easier for them to not worry about their political future as Republicans if they vote against President Trump. So what we expect is then there will be, I don't know the exact term for it, but it will get referred to the Senate. The Senate will hold a trial. And there the president will have a chance to defend himself because, of course, in the first case, what you're going to hear mainly is what the House has concluded based on their investigations. So then in the second instance, in the Senate, the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, has already said by law he is required to automatically conduct a hearing. He said he can, however, decide how long the hearing goes or how short it goes, but he will have to give a chance for each side to give some sort of statement at a minimum. So the House will put forward its charges, the president will reply, and a vote will be taken. And this was just as it was in the 70s with Richard Nixon, and in the House they voted to impeach.
Except Nixon resigned before it got to the Senate. So
right, exactly, yeah.
Probably knowing that the majority would vote him out. Because the next step then would either be removal from office or it fails.
Correct.
What happens if it fails?
If it fails, we'll see what the timing is, because when they take the vote, President Trump may be already out of office, he may be a lame duck, or he may still be in office.
Maybe in the middle
we
of
have
an
elections,
election.
exactly. We may have a split screen where the Senate is voting whether to impeach him or not, and the people are voting whether to re-elect him or not.
And technically, as far as the Constitution goes, then Vice President Pence takes over as president.
Correct, because the only two people elected by the entire population and then electoral Congress are the president and vice president.
Exactly. What happens if the vice president is implicated in this? In the impeachment probe?
My guess is he could also be impeached. That's a political decision that, interestingly, Nancy Pelosi will have to make. And as you well know, the third in line under our Constitution is the majority leader of the House.
Right. Gets very interesting, doesn't
yes,
it, over
it
next?
does.
It's going to be a very hot year. But what does it mean in terms of foreign policy? I mean, looking at this coldly, if it's proven that there was this abuse of power with a foreign country, with a foreign government for domestic political purposes. What signal does this send to our allies and our partners around the world?
That we're not living up to standards we're asking them to live up to. I mean, right now we do not look like a strong democracy. We don't look like we believe. We have a president in office who constantly says things and does things that demonstrate a lack of respect for rule of law. And the thing I think that we Americans are I think there are a few things we're most proud of. One is rule of law. I mean, the fact that we have laws, we implement them, we believe in them. In essence, we are not, it's linked to the second thing, which is our multi-ethnic society.
Right.
We are not an ethnic nationalist society. We are a civic nationalist society, which means we as Americans, we sign up to be American when we sign up to obey and defend the Constitution of the United States when you become a citizen. Okay, if you're born as a citizen, it's implicit. And that's something we're very proud of. We think it makes us special, and it means no matter what your background is before you get here, so long as you abide by our laws and that democratic culture, you can be American.
Do you think it will, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of dealing with other governments, would it create suspicion among some governments? What is the president saying to other governments about us, above our heads, that we don't know about?
Of course, yeah.
What transactional deals have been made here?
I mean, by now, I think a lot of people were skeptical about President Trump, and the fact that even before we found out that the staff in the White House are burying the transcripts of phone calls in super secret computers. We already saw very little coming out of the White House when President Trump had a phone call, and in some cases we didn't find out until the foreign leader told us in the form of a press release, and that I noticed most often in the case of Russia.
Right.
And there have been meetings where there were no staff present with foreign leaders, again, mainly Russia. And so we have a lot of concern. The president, in essence, is asking the American people to trust that he's doing their business when he's in these meetings, and at least half of America doesn't trust him.
Can you started about this earlier, Evelyn, but can you explain to us how Putin stands to benefit from this? I mean, I think there are two ways: domestically, in terms of the political chaos or political crisis here, but also internationally.
Yeah.
They've been boasting about how America's now giving up on Ukraine.
Putin has he has one main objective, which is really to reestablish a sphere of influence for Russia in the former Soviet space, and if he can expand it, towards the East Bloc, great. He wants Russia to be influential again. He wants to maintain his own autocratic, kleptocratic government in power. And in order to achieve that, he needs a weak United States, because we have always been the country that stood up for the international institutions, the system that was set up after World War II to replace the balance of power system, a system also based on rule of law, based on a respect for sovereignty and self-determination and people and minority rights and treaties, right? And so Putin wants to do away with all of this. He just wants big leaders to make deals, and because he thinks that will benefit him more than this international system. He's come to believe that the international institutional system only helps America and the democracies. So it's also crazy that our president is joining Putin in attacking international institutions and weakening them. And that's, again, Putin benefits by weakening the United States because he can get his way with Ukraine and other countries if the U.S. is not assisting them, if the U.S. is fighting internally.
Because directly in the Ukraine case, it was military assistance, which Ukraine desperately needs, particularly the Javelin missiles, which Ukraine desperately needs to, let's say, combat the forces that are in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, that are supported directly by the Russian military.
Yes.
So that is undermining the security of a NATO partner, presumably, by delaying. I mean, you worked in DOD. What is the mood in DOD about this?
Well, I would imagine they're quite demoralized because out of the blue, for no apparent reason and no policy reason was given, the bureaucrats, the experts in the Department of Defense were told, stop providing the military assistance put a hold on it. And they are told this in September, I believe, or maybe July. I don't know the exact timing, but towards the end of our fiscal year. So that makes them nervous because they know if they can't spend this money, get it obligated, which takes filling out papers and all of this, then the money will go away and Ukraine will never get that assistance. And in that package, as you said, in the package of assistance was money for javelins, for radios, for maritime security, air defense. I mean, just about a year ago was when the Ukrainian, the 23 sailors and the ships were seized by the Russians in the Sea of Azov. You know, we're providing them now with maritime securities, things that they can use to deter the Russians from taking those things. It's not about offensive action against the Russians. It's about making the Russians stop and think twice. If you attack Ukraine, you're going to have your young men, I don't think they have women in their armed forces, you're going to have them die because there are these Javelin anti-tank weapons, or in the maritime front, also anti-shipping.
There's another part to this. I don't know if you remember in a conversation with Zelensky, where in the press conference actually, where Trump mentioned, I'd like to see you and Putin come to a deal, that then you can come to the White House. So are we pushing Ukraine now basically to give ground to Russia over Crimea, over Donbass?
It sounded like our president was saying that. I don't believe that under the level of the president, so at the level of the cabinet members, that anyone is advocating that Ukraine capitulate. That would be like saying the United States should capitulate. And why do I say that? Because Ukraine, it's the only country where people died holding the European Union flag, literally. I mean, it's a country where the people wanted democracy. They wanted to turn west. They wanted to become as rich as Poland, which historically has been their poor brother, you know. And the young people in Ukraine in particular were very interested in seeing a change away from Yanukovych, who was the previous leader, who just took out all these loans and got Ukraine even more in loaned and indebted to Russia. He ran this very corrupt system, enriching his family. You know, young Ukrainians in particular said enough with this. Zelensky is a guy, you know, he's from the East, he's young, he's inexperienced, but maybe he can do some good. The problem is we need to keep the pressure on, and that's why Ukraine really needs the U.S., so that they don't have to capitulate to Russia.
One of the reasons, and the Muller report showed that Russia was, when I say Russia, the Russian services wanted to have Trump elected because Putin calculated that this would be advantageous for Russia. And one of the key questions was, of course, sanctions. They've been patient. I mean, there's been tremendous resistance. I mean, I know the president himself probably wants sanctions lifted, but there's been tremendous resistance in Congress, in State Department, in Defense Department. Is Trump in a weaker position now in lifting sanctions?
Because of the Ukraine
because of
phone
the
call,
Ukraine
absolutely,
scandal.
absolutely. I think if he were to try to lift sanctions now, people already are making the link that I made. You know, not based so much on him wanting to collect political dirt on his opponent, but on the other thing he mentioned, on getting some fake dirt about 2016 and the origins of the investigation into him working with Russia. He's trying to throw some confusion, throw some mud in people's eyes about what Russia did. That's very dangerous. That's the beginning of a road towards lifting sanctions. And people in America are not that dumb, and hopefully, and certainly Congress is not. And so I think it will make it a lot harder for him. Everyone already is making comments that the only beneficiary of all of this is Vladimir Putin. If you're an investigator, you look, who benefits? Oh,
he
Vladimir
benefits,
Putin.
but there's also a loss, because a weakened president, a lame duck president, is less likely, as you said, to lift sanctions. That would be almost another nail in the coffin at this point.
Yeah, and he cannot lift them by himself. I mean, they're congressionally mandated. So,
precisely, yeah.
You know, if he tries to lift them, let me rephrase that. He could lift some of them unilaterally, because I'm not sure whether they've all been put into law, because many of them were initially put in by executive order, then they were codified by law.
Right.
It's possible he could lift something, but, and of course he can change the pace at which they're implemented, because that's his branch of government that does the implementing.
Right.
But I think you would have an overriding, you know, you would have enough members of Congress outraged that it would override any presidential veto.
Right.
That's the one area where they've been very strong. That and in Saudi Arabia or Yemen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I mean, the whole impeachment question is a huge propaganda victory for the Kremlin, in the sense that now they can point at the United States and say, you call us corrupt, you call us putting pressure, you say we put pressure on other governments, that we try and extort even our allies. The United States does the same.
Yeah, and the other thing they can say is, you want democracy, some of you liberals?
Right.
Look at what democracy is like.
Yep,
It's a mess,
yep, yep.
and it's just as corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not true, because we're not as corrupt as Russia, and we shed the light on our corruption, and we try to do something about it.
And the fact there'll never be an impeachment of Putin, let's put it that way.
Yeah. And there are a lot of laws that are now on the books and making their way through Congress to address actually corruption, transparency,
Right.
as a result of the Russian attack, actually, and the Russians using money that they launder through the United States to get friends and to influence the system.
Let's go last few minutes that we have. Let's go talk now about the Balkans. What impact is this whole, let's say, political battle, if you like, in Washington? You know, we're going to be consumed by this for the next year, and then the elections. So does this mean, what does this mean for our policy in the Balkans?
Well, the one thing I will say that I'm very happy about is there's an assistant secretary right now sitting in the State Department. Well, I don't know if he's sitting there today. He's probably on a plane, but Phil Rieker, I know him very well. Mm-hmm. He's very capable. He's a solid professional. Right. I expect he'll stay till the end, and he's got his eye on the Balkans because he's a long time, person with a lot of
for many years.
So that gives me a lot of hope. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of American professional government folks who are interested in seeing more stability, not giving opening to autocrats like Putin and Xi of China to get in and cause trouble in the Balkans. We already see those two countries trying to increase their influence, using corruption, basically, unfortunately, to gain influence over leaders and businesses and kind of continue to corrupt the body politic there.
So you, in terms of Phil Rieker, but there's also two envoys now that have been appointed. Do you see that there's more focus on the Balkans?
That could be a good thing. I mean, I just don't know. I would have to look at who appointed them, what was the charge that was given to them, what is it that they're to do.
It's still a bit confusing what their relations will be in terms.
I mean, I do think, look, I would say, I'm going to beat you to your next question, because I think one of the biggest omissions we have in terms of U.S. and transatlantic policy, because I think we need the Europeans to work aggressively on this as well. The biggest advances we made, and I'm referring to Kosovo and Kosovo normalization, Kosovo Serbia. The biggest advances we made were when Lady Ashton, I'm forgetting her name now. Kathy Ashton. No, it's Patty Ashton.
Patty Ashton and Cathy Ashley.
Another patriotic British woman came forward, and she was the envoy, and she basically brokered a really good agreement that the two countries, they're still very slowly implementing. So I would like very much for there to be greater emphasis on normalization, bringing Kosovo into the normal international institutions, stopping with the silliness of pretending Kosovo isn't a sovereign state 11 years after it became a sovereign state. Which
is what Serbia wants. I mean, the Serbian government has been pushing for renegotiation of the final status. Presumably this is off the table in any future negotiations.
Well, I shouldn't say again because I haven't raised it yet, but I'm very skeptical of renegotiating the terms of agreements that were made before.
Right.
When I was in government, we thought those were very good agreements. The United States backed everything the EU was doing, and we did not in any way, shape, or form like the idea of land swaps. And I remain very hesitant. Patty Ashton, before he passed away, wrote a letter saying he was very opposed to land swaps. I'm not opposed to them in principle, but I'm very nervous about them in this context, with Putin hovering over the shoulder of the Serbian leader and over the region writ large. Making these kind of swaps right now makes me a little bit nervous. Of course, if the two countries and their peoples accede to this, if they can do it peacefully, in principle, it's not a bad idea to try. But in reality, I'm afraid I can't be supportive.
Yeah, because it could potentially open up other claims to territory.
Too risky, yeah.
But as you said, it has happened before in history. usually after a war, when a country has to surrender some territory.
Yeah.
But the Czechs and the Slovaks, for instance, came to a very good deal. There were some
The velvet
adjustments
split,
between them.
Yeah.
The velvet divorce. If it's possible between Serbia and Kosovo, it shouldn't necessarily be off the table. But as you said, it has to be done in a way that's acceptable to both sides. Kosovo now has a new government. Well, let's say it will very soon, hopefully. New elections took place. There's a new party coming in, potentially a new coalition. What would be your advice to this government? What should it focus on, both domestically and internationally?
Well, I think, number one, it really has to focus on getting a place at the international institutional table, and they should really try to get, I would urge them to get the Germans involved more heavily. The Brits are a bit distracted, unfortunately. So get the Germans to help out. The Germans understand, they're starting to understand they have more power. Show them they can do good with their power. And I think luring the Germans diplomatically into helping would be useful. I think keeping then the specter of, if I were a Kosovar leader, I would want to have Serbia kind of, I guess, enticed by EU membership. I would want to see that that channel would still be open to the EU, because I think it's what enables Vučić and his government to be cooperative with Kosovo to the extent that they are. And maybe they could be more cooperative if the EU showed a little more interest in helping Kosovo accede. The other issue is, of course, internally, economically. A new leadership would be very helpful in terms of addressing corruption, addressing economic opportunity for youth, because you see so many young Kosovars feeling like they have no future and they leave. So I think that would be something that would be useful. Just a fresh start would be a useful thing. I worry a little bit about the nationalists coming into government, because nationalism is not a helpful thing brought to its extreme, and so I would hope that it would be more about patriotism than nationalism. There are enough regional issues there.
In other words, strengthening Kosovo, not the pan-Albanian project.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yeah. And also really take care of the Serbian minority, especially if there is a land deal, because you're going to have then a smaller Serbian minority in Kosovo, and they're going to really need protection, and not just protection, but support from the state. The way that you have significant minorities in other states getting support from the national state, if you will.
One wonders if there's now two American envoys, how European Union is going to react. Whether it's not in the best of conditions, as you said, with the whole Brexit question. There's going to be a change of leadership in Germany pretty soon. So what focus have the Europeans have now? Plus they also have to make a decision, of course, later this month on whether to allow North Macedonia and Albania into formal accession talks.
Yeah.
So they're preoccupied.
Yes.
How do you see their role?
I think they play a critical role, as I said before. If they cannot convince President Vučić that Serbia is still welcome, then Serbia will abandon its constructive attitude, I believe. I mean, that's the big thing that's incentivizing Serbia to move forward with normalization with Kosovo. So that's critical. I think it's also critical to allow North Macedonia in, because again, here's a victory of pragmatism over stupid,
and they took political
stupid nationalism.
And they took political risks.
And they took political risks, not only the North Macedonians themselves, but the Greek, the Syriza party, which you wouldn't have expected. I believe that they should be vindicated by having that small country enter the EU. It's not going to kill the EU. It's going to be hard actually for North Macedonia, but they should do it. And same with Albania. Just put the pressure on them to make sure they reform, make sure they deal with the corruption.
There's one, maybe have this as the last question, there's one wild card in all this, of course, and that's Russia. We've already mentioned it in the context of Ukraine, context of our elections, and interference in other elections, by the way. But in terms of the Balkans, the Russians have always wanted, or the Kremlin has always wanted this region to be, let's say, insecure, outside of NATO, outside of the EU. We saw what they did in Montenegro, how they tried to meddle in North Macedonia as well. Do you think the Russians now, after we've appointed envoys, will insist they have an envoy to the talks? And what will be our reaction to this?
They may well try, but in the past we would not have even countenanced such a thing, and neither side would have countenanced such a thing.
Well, they were involved initially in the Bosnian resolution until we left them out and actually got a resolution with Dayton.
Right, but that was well before, I mean, I believe it was
in the
before
90s.
Putin, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so now with Putin on the scene, it's a different story.
But do you think with this president, all we've said about his views of Russia, he could try and allow the Russians into the process? It's a wild card I'm putting out there, but I'm trying to consider all possibilities.
I mean, if it were to be accepted by his cabinet, he could try it. If his cabinet were to accept it, it would be sort of in a contact group, six-party talk kind of way, meaning the Russians wouldn't really be in on the real action. They could just sit at the big table, and they would have to agree to the overall, whatever the settlement was that was worked out by the actual people who are rolling up their sleeves in the negotiating process.
Well, it's interesting because the only agreements that have been resolved and implemented in the Balkans have been without Russia. Dayton, Ohrid, and Prespa.
Yeah.
So it tells you something.
Yes, it does.
Evelyn, I'd love to have you back at some point because this impeachment thing isn't going to go away and it could have reverberations in foreign policy of which we are not yet aware. So things could develop quite fast. But thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Giannis.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshu.